A big welcome to everybody. It is such a pleasure to see so many of you here today and to know that we've all come together in support of a school that's meant so much to us. I'm Bonnie Wilson, proud SAIS graduate and former Associate Dean. Thank you for coming today. We're here to celebrate the SAIS Legacy Circle and to honor those people who have documented their commitment to the future of SAIS in their estate plans. As we all know, SAIS has a long and proud history, and we look back on that history with warmth and nostalgia. But we also look to the future and to those students who, with our help, will shape the future of the school and of the world in the years ahead. A few of those students are here today to share their gratitude and their experiences with you. Thank you for all you've done to help them learn and to lead. I don't want to take too much of your time because we've got a wonderful program ahead of us, but I do need to announce some interesting news with respect to legacy giving. As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of SAIS, one of the generous members of our Board of Advisors has offered to match 5% up to $25,000 of any legacy gift of $100,000 or more for financial aid, and to create a current fellowship in the name of that donor. So if you are thinking about giving and haven't documented yet, this is a wonderful way to make the impact felt immediately. Thank you in advance. And now it's time for lunch.
Sorry to break the conversation. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and it's my great honor to welcome so many friends back to the school, members of the SAIS Legacy Circle, the Christian Herder Society, generous donors, students, faculty, staff, and our alumni. This event honors your generosity and long-term commitment to the school. In particular, I would like to recognize the three co-chairs of our Legacy Circle, Bonnie Wilson, Sally Shelton Colby, and Jill McGovern, who unfortunately could not be with us today, for their service and leadership of this circle. Johns Hopkins SAIS, yes. They have done tremendous work in making this circle a success and leading it in at least in the time that I remember I've been here at SAIS. So really, genuinely, thank you. Johns Hopkins SAIS has significantly expanded its faculty and diversified its curriculum. We, of course, stand on the shoulders of the legacy of the many faculty that you knew when you were here and the curriculum that you've studied, but we have worked in terms of renewing, rejuvenating our faculty and the curriculum. And this effort has created tremendous opportunity for SAIS in terms of its programming and world-class expertise on the front lines in international affairs. The task before SAIS now is to use this investment in faculty in order to undertake a similarly audacious transformation of its programs, particularly at a time when changes in the world demand new approaches to new topics and addressing new challenges in world affairs. So as SAIS celebrates its 75th anniversary, we are embarking on ambitious effort to review and reform our curriculum and our programs, including introduction of new subjects of study and also new degrees. Most recently, a Doctorate of International Affairs, or as we call it affectionately, DIA, which actually was a brainchild of Professor Cohen, which is the newest degree we are offering here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it is designed to service experienced professionals who seek further expertise through an advanced practitioner's degree. This degree would launch formally this fall. Our work will define SAIS going forward, and in doing so, it will refine the field of advanced study of international relations as well. And another critical transition, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, and which also will be of tremendous gain for the school and will brand it globally even more than is the case today, is our move to a new facility, which is on 555 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is currently the museum building. That building is now being acquired by Johns Hopkins University. There will be a period during which it has to be repurposed for the needs of an institution of higher learning and will become the home of SAIS. I know a lot of you have tremendous amount of nostalgia about this building and the other buildings that we have on Massachusetts Avenue. Of course, SAIS's legacy will forever be associated with this part of town, but I'm sure you would attest that we were in need of newer and a bit more expanded facilities. So this will bring us tremendous opportunities going forward, not just in terms of having bigger and better facilities, but also in terms of new kinds of programming and collaboration, both within the school and with Johns Hopkins University. We all at SAIS have been celebrating the important milestone of the 75th anniversary of this institution. I've celebrated over the past year with many of our alumni, as have my colleagues, in signature 75th anniversary events around the world, most notably in London, Hong Kong, Seoul, Dubai, as well as a number of American cities. To date, we have had 580 alumni attend these signature events worldwide. And the rest of our alumni have celebrated on their own, and as many as 1,800 have attended over 60 events in over 20 countries. And this not only speaks to the level of our alumni engagement and the enthusiasm for marking this momentous time in the school's history, but also about the footprint of this institution globally. The 75th is an opportunity for SAIS to boast our world-class faculty and diligently strive toward attracting a diverse and vibrant student body. We hope you will all join us on October 24th here in Washington in order to celebrate the 75th anniversary under the theme of Shaping the World. Now, as we move forward, we recognize the generosity of those of you present here. I would also like to acknowledge the many students in attendance who have received fellowships from the Legacy Circle members. Thank you for the time you've taken to join us today, and we all look forward to your continued support of SAIS as we build upon the past in order to chart the way into the future. I would now like to introduce you to the panel for this afternoon on the future of Syria. We have with us Lieutenant General David W. Barno, a retired U.S. military general who is a visiting professor of strategic studies and a senior fellow at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies here at SAIS. General Barno currently teaches The Human Face of Battle, which examines the experience of war from the viewpoint of a frontline soldier, a sailor, airman, or Marine. He's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. General Barno earned his master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University. We won't hold that against you, General. He's a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and the U.S. Army War College. He has had distinguished tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. Daniel Server serves as an academic director of both conflict management and American foreign policy programs here at SAIS. Dr. Server combines scholarly depth with practical knowledge of policymaking. He received this PhD from Princeton University in history and is the author of numerous publications, and many of them penned while he's been here at SAIS with us. He has extensive experience as a diplomat, having served the rank of Minister Counselor in the Department of State. And finally, Dr. Sarah Sewell is the Speyer Family Foundation Distinguished Scholar at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. Her career in academia and government combines international security and human rights. She currently teaches a course on global migration, which explores contemporary issues in refugee and migration policy through competing lenses of international human rights and the state's construction of national interest. She received her AB from Harvard College and DPhil from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She has previously served as Assistant Secretary of Defense and Undersecretary for Civilian, Human Rights, and Democracy. You can find the full bio of our speakers today in your program. So without further ado, let me invite our panelists to the podium, and Dr. Serva will moderate the conversation. Please.
Sit in the middle. I sit closest to the yeah. It's a great pleasure to be here with both of you. And a great pleasure also to have this opportunity to talk about the future of Syria, which somebody defined to me recently as the place of only bad choices. But we're not going to do it the usual way. We're not going to lecture at you for 20 minutes each and then ask if you have questions. Instead, we're going to ask you to ask your questions first. And the way this works is that I stand here until hands start going up. So you'll be a great help to me if you'll participate as quickly as possible. It's my theory that when people come to an event with a title like Future of Syria, they come with questions. And all questions are fair game. That's what the wisdom is here for. And I see one already. Thank you very much. And I will take notes on the questions so that you can keep us honest that we actually try to answer them.
I would be interested in what the panelists think is the likely ethnic and religious outcome in Syria going forward.
Ethnic and religious outcome. Who's next?
Lots of hands, great. Should Syria be put back together again the way it has been?
Back together or not? The partition question. Please.
Why are we committing American troops in Syria?
Why risk Americans?
Thank you. How should we consider the challenge of countering violent extremism, the CVE mission, which has been focused in large part on ISIS or ISIL, but leaves a lot of uncovered space otherwise?
Jim, let me be clear about this. You're asking what that focus should be in Syria? Correct. Please.
How could this catastrophe have been avoided or stopped?
how to avoid. I think you can see already why I take questions first. These are fabulous questions.
How do we navigate competing strategic interests of Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the United States?
Turkey, Iran, Russia, US. I think I got the tags right.
How has it affected U.S. leadership in the region?
Impact on US in Middle East.
Since
One more,
since Assad
please.
since Assad arguably won the civil war, isn't it time to sit down and talk to him about the future of Syria?
Should we talk to Assad? And one more. I have room for only one more. Please, up there. No, here.
What are the long-term effects of this conflict in terms of humanitarian law?
Especially the humanitarian side.
Yes, given the fact that this conflict has witnessed some of the most egregious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. What are the consequences of that in terms of normative standards going forward?
Great. I had one more here. Yeah.
We often talk of keeping order despite the cost. Is there ever a time when disorder might be better for those on the ground, if not for the larger order?
Okay. Fabulous. Let me stop there because we only have half an hour. But I'm going to turn the list of questions a little bit so that my colleagues can see it a little bit. And, you know, pick what you like. But Sarah, if you would start us off with the long-term humanitarian effects and effects on humanitarian norms, I think that's that question was meant for you.
Okay. It's a great question, and I'd like to try to unpack it in two different dimensions. I'd like to first talk about what it means for international humanitarian law in terms of the use of force against civilians, or what happens to civilians in the context of the use of force. But I think I'd also like to talk about what it might mean for the refugee regime because of the strains that the conflict itself has created for a normative framework that now seems is now revealed as woefully inadequate. So on the first point, we states, and I'm going to sort of take the royal we, pretend to be a state, but I think states have told themselves a consoling narrative about international humanitarian law for some time, and we, the United States, of the states, have really been at the forefront of being able to both explain and demonstrate why international humanitarian law, which has protections for civilians in the context of armed conflict, and why human rights law, which guarantees certain freedoms and rights in peacetime, is so important. We've been able to afford that, essentially. And so, because we were the dominant military power, the conduct of our military operations was in relative terms exceedingly attuned to protecting civilians and upholding international humanitarian law. And we can debate all the outliers, but as a whole, I'm comfortable making that statement. But we also were a leading proponent of human rights around the globe. The Syria context, both in terms of how the Assad government itself treated its civilians, so whether you're using a peacetime frame or whether you're using an international humanitarian law frame, the use of barrel bombs against people who had political disagreements and were not necessarily using force against a regime was really the revelation that the norms that we said states would uphold were not norms that you could count on states upholding. We had convinced ourselves that it was largely non-state actors that violated most of these propositions, and that states, as responsible stewards of an international system, were moving, sort of the arc was bending toward compliance. And what we saw very clearly in the case of Syria is a government that grossly violated those norms and thereby gave permission to other states, as well as non-state actors that we had been trying to differentiate from states as being irresponsible upstarts in this international community, basically validated the erosion of these norms, to your question. So the widespread consensus that what Syria was doing deserved opprobrium through the United Nations and through most Western diplomatic state mouthpieces did absolutely nothing to change behavior. And so it revealed, in a way, not just the inherent lack of enforcement in international humanitarian law and international law as a whole, but also this myth that it was the people who didn't have a vested stake in the system who would violate it. And when states themselves who created these rules and norms and eventually laws to provide reciprocal benefit in a state system violate them, then you begin to see, I think, the implicit premise of the question is the unraveling of these norms. And so it's not a good thing. But I would argue there's a larger geopolitical shift in terms of states coming to power in the international system that really don't give a fig about the norms anyway. And here I'll name out, China, Russia, such that Syria, I would argue, is a harbinger, not the reason for the decline. I think there's a bigger context in which the lack of enforcement, even when it's hypocritical, that the US has provided on humanitarian norms is going to be missing, and we're going to see a broader shift that will make Syria look like part of a pattern as we connect the dots going forward. So, short answer, it ain't good. Let me go quickly to refugees. I think to some degree what has happened in Syria was, again, an accelerant in a broader trend, which is that we created rules to protect the rights of people who lost their rights to citizenship in their own country and who therefore were forced migrants across borders. And we said that they should have rights to find citizenship elsewhere. Frankly, the scale of the problem today, of which Syria is a major accelerant but not the only reason, has so dwarfed the expectations of those who wrote these rules and who thought that this was a manageable problem, that we've revealed that the construct, both normative and legal, is entirely insufficient to provide any meaningful protections. And we're at a point now where we really need to renegotiate to what class of persons, under what circumstances, do states of whom they are not citizens owe obligations. This is a hugely important and disruptive, as we've seen in the European case, set of questions that the international community is not even well equipped to debate, as witnessed the last two global summits that they've had on this occasion. So I'll stop there, but I would say in both respects, I think we're seeing real strains revealed, but I think they are not even proximate causes. They are really symbols of broader phenomena.
Just a footnote to Sarah's remarks. The last time I looked, there were 6.3 million refugees out of a population pre-war of, 21 million, something like that.
Well, just think about the fact that 1 in 3 people in Lebanon is a refugee. I mean, imagine that here.
General, I see some questions towards the top there. Why risk the U.S. and what do we do about, are we doing it right when we're fighting violent extremists in Syria? Would you like to take those on?
Yeah, let me start maybe with two prefaces. One, our list of questions doesn't kind of include the strategic context that we're asking these questions within, which is where does Syria fall in the gamut of U.S. foreign policy priorities around the world, and what's competing with that as we talk through answers to this? Because we could probably all come up with a set of answers by marshaling the majority of our government resources on Syria and figuring out how to make that better. Unfortunately, Syria is one of 100 plus problems we're dealing with in the world. We have to sort out where that is in the broader priorities. Secondly, I would argue in light of that, and we've got that about midway on the chart, Syria now is going to be more, and has emerged in the last couple of years, I think, more about the countries that are involved in the Syrian civil war. It's going to be more about U.S. and Iran. And I think actions that we've taken in the last week or so here in terms of projecting more military force to the Gulf reinforce the fact that we're now going to be looking at that very much through the lens of competition with Iran. It's going to be about Syria and Turkey. We've already seen the Turks' interest in the border area and the Kurds has been a challenge to how the U.S. is trying to exert its interest there and even use our military power in the region, which is very, very small in Syria right now. We can talk a bit more about that. It's about Israel. Israel is looking at the Assad regime in ways that are very different than we do and has been willing for many years to consider Assad staying in power as a reliable neighbor to have pointed conversations with as opposed to dealing with chaos next door in Syria. It's about Iraq. It's about our role in Iraq and what role Iraq is going to have in the region vis-a-vis its very close partner in some ways in Iran and with the Gulf states who have very, very different views there. And so there are a variety of different players there that are changing how the United States looks at Syria. Russia, of course, I think I mentioned as well. This is the first place we've seen Russia project out-of-area power since the end of the Cold War. And it's a huge development. We've probably undercounted its impact both in the region and on us globally. So why should the U.S. be risking military forces or other diplomatic personnel out there in this region? This is, in a sense, I think, something we have some degree of obligation to do if the region is a priority for us and if having some kind of stability in the region, however we define that, is important. We're going to have to use military power in part to help achieve that outcome. I think absurdly, we now have about 400 U.S. military personnel on the ground in Syria. That's only about 5 rooms like this. That's ludicrous. It has no particular value outside of the symbolic value to it. I don't think we should have 20,000 Americans or 200,000 Americans in Syria, but we need to be thinking about what kind of impact the force we have had there for the last 2 or 3 years, which has been around, from what I can gather, 2,000 to 2,500 Americans have had on the defeat of ISIS, which is our principal military reason for being there, and achieving what outcomes have occurred here in pursuing that goal. So I think some military power, probably more than 400 Americans, is the right answer. And we've gotten a lot of value in that. President Trump saw that differently. In fact, contradicted most of his advisors who were making very explicit statements in the fall of last year that we're going to be in Syria as long as we need to be in Syria to defend our interest and to push back explicitly on Iran. In December, the president announced we're pulling everybody out of Syria, and we're doing it in about 30 days, I think was the initial announcement. That was modified a bit here in the last couple of months, but now the number appears to be stabilized at about 400, which again has very little value. So I think we need to be there militarily. I think we need to be there with a modest president. I think we've achieved a lot in the last 3 years with a very small number of American troops, particularly with regard to the defeat of ISIS, which we haven't really talked about here, in Syria, such that they don't have territory under their control any longer. They're still capable, but they're now not in control of a big chunk of Syria and western Iraq. So we've achieved a lot with a small amount of forces. I think we are better off keeping small forces around the world doing these kinds of efforts than we are taking them out entirely because we're tired of committing that force and taking those risks. So that'd be a quick thought on that.
Could we turn maybe to the impact on U.S. role in the Middle East more generally and this question of relations with Turkey, Iran, Russia? Sarah, steer us through this rather confused situation.
So building on, I will try, but I'm not sure because it's a very confused situation. And building on General Barnow's comments, if you put yourself in the mind of what I understand to be the Trump administration's anti-Iran focus, it made no sense for the president to decide that we would bolt and run because, from one perspective, one way to look at the region is to sort of squint and say, we've handed Iraq over to the Iranians on a silver platter by virtue of their demographics. Now we've got, the Russians have come and made us look like complete chumps in Syria, and they're tight with Assad, and now we've got Assad and Russia and Iran through Iraq. Wow, right? That is a sort of a reverse encirclement, right? That is, it doesn't make much sense in terms of an American view about isolating Iran. So then if you step back and you say what is sort of conventional foreign policy wisdom says, it says stability. Well, we kind of threw that out when we decided to invade Iraq. That was when we made the big bet we'd rather have democracy than stability. So if you really want to know how to avoid Assyria, Elliot, you have to go back to Iraq. I mean, that's my own judgment, is that's when we sort of let the cat out of the bag in terms of moving the puzzle pieces and fueling radicalism throughout the region. But I think the big takeaway from American foreign policy is that we've lost leverage. It doesn't care which squint you have. If it's a stability squint or if it's of an anti-Iran squint. The United States has fundamentally lost face, in part because of decisions that Barack Obama made to back down when he made a threat. I mean, there is such a litany of sort of schizophrenia and missed opportunity and schizophrenic communication, and the ways in which our erstwhile allies, whether they were on the ground or whether they were neighbors, have acted in ways that have complicated what was always going to be a fraught question. But I think the fundamental takeaway from me in terms of US interests is that we look like we haven't clarified what we want, because I would argue that that's sort of what the record would suggest, and that we have managed to minimize our options going forward. The minute we telegraphed that we were not going to play a major military role, even with strikes, we basically gave the green light to Russia to come in and orchestrate those politics and all kinds of odd bedfellows in terms of Israel and in terms of Turkey, the way Dave was just talking about. We've basically lost control of this game. Not that we ever had control, but we looked like we didn't know what we were doing, and everyone else looks like they've outmaneuvered us, whether it's Erdogan or whether it's Putin. So net negative for the US right now, regardless of how this plays out going forward.
General, I wonder if I can tempt you to talk a little bit about Turkey and what's happened with the US-Turkish relationship.
Well, I think it's a fraught relationship. I mean, Turkey's a NATO member, and for decades, the U.S. has had a very close military relationship with Turkey through NATO. We still have bases inside of Turkey. We still have NATO headquarters with U.S. officers in them, to include some commanders inside of Turkey. But we're also now in an environment where we're not sure exactly what side Erdogan and the Turkish government is on. I'm not sure we could rely on Turkey to fulfill any of its NATO commitments if an Article 5 issue came to the table. And so this is uncharted territory in a lot of respects with regard to where we go with Turkey. We also have interests that very much conflict between the United States and Turkey as we look at the Kurdish region here, both in Western Iraq and in northeastern Syria. And we've been fortunate not to actually get into a shooting match with Turkish forces in that area, because we've had Americans and Turks, Americans allied with the Kurdish forces there, could have very easily come into contact with Turkish forces that were trying to suppress them. So this is a problematic relationship going forward. Ironically, though, Erdogan has not tried to push American troops out. He has not done anything serious in terms of restricting the use of those bases that are critical inside of Turkey to support some of the air operations that are going on here. So it's very difficult to tell how this is all going to unfold in the coming months. And it affects not only the U.S., but all the other NATO members and the regional states as well. So I can't predict where this is going to go, but it is not a healthy environment. And some of it may come down to what does the U.S. ultimately decide to do with the Kurdish relationship, with the U.S.-Kurdish relationship, particularly in the military. And the military, I think the U.S. military is sensitive to the fact that we have partnered on the ground with Kurdish forces for years. They've borne the brunt of the fighting against ISIS. U.S. advisors have worked closely with the Kurds. We've had a very close mill-to-mill, if you will, relationship with the Kurds dating back to the first Gulf War and the end of that in northern Iraq. And we're at the cusp of pretty much abandoning that relationship and walking away from it and leaving them to whatever happens next. That's going to be, inside the U.S. military, I think, problematic, and it's going to be a very difficult, very bitter pill for military people that have worked with these forces and that have prosecuted U.S. objectives for the last 4 years explicitly to walk away from that. So I don't know where that's going to go.
Let me say a quick word about the map that went up. This is a map of areas of control inside Syria. it's extraordinarily misleading. It looks like there are clear-cut areas of control with a few specks here and there of somebody else's control. The red is the government, the green is various rebel forces, the yellow is the Americans with the Syrian Democratic Forces, Kurds, and Arabs. But if you go to the next slide, can we go to, this shows you how misleading the first slide was, because those dark red areas are areas of fairly recent ISIS attacks. The darker brown is areas where ISIS has a good deal of support, and you see that they're really quite extensively arrayed still against us. And if you look at the next slide, we can go to this, to the P question, the partition question in Syria. This is a pre-war ethnic and religious map of Syria, and what it amounts to is that Syria, apart from a gigantic empty desert, is a sea of Sunnis with some Christians, some Shia, some others mixed in, the Druze in the south and also farther north. The Kurds, who today occupy pretty much a good part of the northern border with Turkey, in fact did not have that kind of contiguous presence in pre-war Syria. So when people are talking about partition of Syria, and I have good friends and colleagues who've talked about that, you show me where the lines are going to be drawn. They can't be, is the answer. Not without moving many more people than have already been moved. I admit that some of these people have been moved, but not mostly the minorities. The Christians, a lot of them have left, but the majority is Sunni, and the majority of the refugees are also Sunni because they were people who were protesting against Assad's minority Alawite government. So I think this question of partition is really kind of out of the question, and certainly out of the question for Assad. Somebody asked about talking with Assad. So Sarah, should we be talking with Assad?
Well, I actually want to push back on the statement that you just made, Dan. I mean, remember, you do too, yeah. Okay, so we're grumpy over here on this side.
Okay.
So remember Iraq, the first Operation Iraqi Freedom, and remember the violence that was reminiscent of what Assad has done, which was Saddam using chemical weapons against his own people, primarily the Kurdish rebels who were not co-sympathetic, ethnically or politically with his regime. They fled. They did not exist. There were no clear lines. The Kurds had regions, but they were embedded in with everybody else in Iraq. But they fled from persecution, which is forced migration sort of happening, although it's internal displacement when it's in the borders, and they went north, right? And I remember going as a congressional staffer to see the camps that the U.S. military had set up in Operation Provide Comfort in these completely perilous mountains in Iraq. We ended up providing air cover for that presence until we returned to Iraq in military form. It was not without some costs, but we didn't lose American lives. And the Kurds were able to create what essentially became Democratic Kurdistan for all intents and purposes, which is now a de facto petitioned part of Iraq. So if you want to look at that history and say, what's the play here for the U.S.? The cynical play for the U.S. is to not fully abandon, but instead continue to instrumentalize the Kurds, who, by the way, do have women fighting in their military, and they talk democratic talk, and they have a really interesting ideological sort of foundation that is far removed from Assad's. The play is you provide them air cover, and you basically help them continue to either contain or either sustain or expand their zone, and you try to facilitate the movement of persons who find themselves at risk within Assad's continued rule, unless you're willing to really do something completely different, to find refuge in that area. So that becomes basically the craw that you stick in Assad and Russia's.
General,
Yeah, I go back a slide, maybe, let's see if we can do that.
can we go back? Yeah.
And maybe one more. So again, this is recognizing this is imperfect, and we see that in the interim slide. But I think my thought would be that our best outcome might right now might be to try and freeze frame where everyone is currently occupied, and to find ways to stabilize that and protect that. The two most likely threats against that, I think, are the Assad government and his forces, enabled by the Russians, taking more territory, and I think that has to be prevented from happening, and that's doable, and the U.S. could play a role there. And then the Turks taking Kurdish occupied territory now and trying to suppress the Kurdish forces there, and I think the U.S. can facilitate that not happening as well. But there has to be some degree of discussions between, I would argue, the U.S. and Turkey, and the U.S. and the Syrian regime, in order to quietly establish a status quo in where we are right now, and then find ways to protect that, because all the migrations that could happen have not happened yet, but significant migrations out of the areas that are unacceptable to the people living there have occurred. And that might be our best worst case outcome right now, is to find a way to freeze this where it is. But we can't do that if we continue to signal we're going to take out all American troops. Again, I don't think we need a lot there, but we need more than 400. And I think we will reinforce our objectives of keeping ISIS from resurging in that area once again, and trying to maintain this relationship with the Kurds, which has been very important to us.
If I understood correctly, Sarah was suggesting that we should be talking to Assad about freezing.
I think we're saying basically the same thing. I don't think you need to talk to Assad, though, to do it necessarily.
That's my question. Did you agree? Right. Yeah. I still say that there are a lot of people on the wrong side of the line, yes, and I don't believe that the Turks will accept a Kurdish area outside of Damascus's control.
If we guarantee no movement, though, I mean, that would have to go with it.
Yeah,
we'd have to become a security
We'll talk
safeguard.
about this later. Other questions that we may not have answered yet. Well, is disorder better? Is disorder ever better?
I don't think the outcome of this would be disorder. I think it'd be worse than disorder. I think the potential outcome, again, I kind of look at if the U.S. just takes its interests and goes home, right? Takes its troops out, takes out any diplomatic efforts, let the water level fall to where it's going to fall naturally. I think you're going to see the Turks try to eliminate the Kurds and have no real opposition to doing that. And I think you would see the Assad government try and take more territory and destroy any of the opposition to them. And there'd be an immense amount of bloodshed that probably at the end of the day would result in some kind of a stabilized position, but it would be not in U.S. interests. So I think we can prevent that with a fairly modest amount of continued resources.
But we'd need more troops than we have
need more
today.
than 400. There's almost nothing you can do to include having a parade with 400 troops. So you need more than 400, yes.
Can I just make one other point on
Please.
that? Which is that one of the things that we forget is that the exodus that you referred to earlier, Professor Serwer, the sheer number of people who are now out, who are Syrian, who are outside of Syria's borders, none of the states that have them, the neighboring states, so neither Jordan nor Lebanon wants them there permanently. Now, Erdogan has a political advantage vis-a-vis the Sunni population and his Islamicization agenda within Turkey. But for Lebanon and Jordan, those people need to go somewhere. And I think it's pretty clear that there are not a whole lot of other Western states that want to resettle them. And so repatriation is going to be a real pressure that we are going to consistently hear from those neighboring countries. One of the things that a continued guarantor role of some form that involved territory could let you think about doing would be safe return. So if you want to try to talk about how do you get the Europeans vested in rebuilding parts of Syria, they're not going to do it under Assad, even though their interest is in returning people to Syria. But maybe they would do it if there were a non-Assad run area. But in the absence of regime change for Assad, you're really stuck in terms of returning to status quo ante in a meaningful way in terms of the population movement.
For what it's worth, currently the Assad regime they've learned to concentrate their forces, and that's an important thing in military action. And they've concentrated their forces on the southern and western edges of Idlib, which have important highways. They're not caring at all about eastern Syria and the American presence for the moment. That can wait so far as they're concerned. They want to drive a lot more people out of Idlib. Idlib is full of people who have opposed Assad, and he wants them out. So this war isn't over, is what I would say. And people are starting to think about and talk about reconstruction, and I think that's a good thing, but it's not going to happen right away. Any final thoughts, General?
I would add that, maybe going back to what I said at the beginning, is that we need to perhaps look at the Syrian future now through the lens of where are the U.S. priorities in the region to start with. And I think it's, for better or for worse, it's clear that our priorities have now turned to Iran. And so what would be the footprint in Syria that the U.S. ought to aspire to in order to create the right kind of conditions to keep pressure on Iran? And short of going to war with Iran, which is all on the table as well out there. And so I think this issue of how many troops, what do they do, what should we be looking for as the posture for all of our friends and allies, the other nations in the coalition that have been with us in Syria? How do we try and set that up in a way that advances our interests with regard to essentially containing Iran and preventing them from having an even bigger role in the region? So I think that's a different lens than we would have looked at this 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago. We would have probably been looking primarily at ISIS. Still something we want to pay attention to, and our presence there will help keep that from recurring. But I think now the big focus is going to be on Iran.
Sarah?
I would love to be able to make ISIS Assad's problem instead of ours. And so if you don't have a buffer that keeps them in Assad's territory, that's hard to do. So I would agree with Dave.
I think I'd like to thank General Barno and Professor Sewell, and thank you for your questions. Thank you.
If I could have your attention, please. If I could have your attention, please. You know, I don't know about you, but listening to this fascinating and inspiring and saddening at the same time discussion about Syria, it makes me wish I were a student again, which I was 50 years ago. My thanks to all of you who have come. I'm Sally Schulten-Colby. My thanks to all of you who have come. It is so important for all of us to get our legacy to SAIS written up by lawyers and accountants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I was thinking as Bonnie and I were driving here today, there are so many things that we all can do for SAIS beyond the money, although that's terribly important. But we can, I teach at another university in this town that will remain nameless, and it's always a bit difficult for me because I have to be loyal to that university, but my first loyalty is to SAIS, and I'm constantly mentioning SAIS very quietly, threatening my students. If they tell anyone at this other university that I've recommended SAIS, they get an F. But I'm constantly recommending SAIS to students. It's the best. And I could not have done what I've done professionally had it not been for SAIS and all those blasted courses on economics that I had to take, that I hated at the time. But boy, they have surely paid off. And I was telling Marjorie Sonnenfeld, that I took a course with her husband for a year-long course on the Soviet Union. And that too prepared me so well. I mean, I can go on and on, but I won't. I'm here basically to thank you all for coming, to thank you for everything you do for SAIS, and we'll see you at the 75th, which is hard to imagine, and it's this fall. Where is it going to be, actually? I assume it will be in this building, in the new building? In the new building. Okay, so we will hear about the agenda once it's developed. Thank you all again.